Welcome to Green Building Matters, the original and most popular podcast focused on the green building movement. Your host is Charlie Cichetti, one of the most credentialed experts in the green building industry and one of the few to be honored as a lead fellow. Each week, Charlie welcomes a green building professional from around the globe to share their war stories, career advice, and unique insight into how sustainability is shaping the built environment. So settle in, grab a fresh cup of coffee, and get ready to find out why green building matters.
Episode 300. I've got to admit to all of you, all of our listeners, our loyal listeners, or heck, maybe this is the first time you're listening to the Green Building Matters podcast. Well, I'm your host, Charlie Cichetti. Believe it or not, I've been doing this for almost 6 years, and this is episode number 300. Technically, in your feed right now, it probably says 301, but episode number 1 is, hey, where to start? What's this all about? And that was a long time ago, February 2018. So much has changed. We've gone through a pandemic. We've accelerated green buildings and healthy buildings and net zero and so much more. And I'm just having a blast. And so thank you again for being a listener. Thank you for your feedback through LinkedIn or email me or you see me at a conference. You know, there's a whole team that's behind the podcast, and I want to give them a shout out. I want to give a shout out to Danny, who organizes the behind the scenes production of the Green Building Matters podcast. We've got Dragan, who is just a wizard when it comes to making me and my guests sound amazing on audio. He is just an audio technician wizard. We've got Christina, who behind the scenes helps coordinate everything and make sure we're on schedule with all of our guests, our production, and then, yes, that gets out to the world on time. And so thank you, Danny, Dragan, and Christina. You're doing a fantastic job producing this podcast. I've also got to give a shout out to my executive assistant, Jackie, who keeps me organized, helps make sure we can fit in the proper amount of interviews, because I dedicate a lot of my time to make sure this is a success, make sure this podcast continues to encourage our industry. And then Carla, it just really makes my life so much easier when it comes to our Green Building Matters podcast, also coordinating our guests, making sure they're getting our podcast questions ahead of time. And just, behind the scenes, you don't know Carla, but she is such a hard worker here for the Green Building Education Services, the GBS team, as well as the podcast that all of you are listening to and have been for years now. So thank you. Thank you, Carla. Thank you, podcast team. Frankly, I have the easy part. I just do the interview, try to bring a little humor, ask some great questions, and then I just upload a file to Dropbox. And that team that I just called out, they do everything else. And they launch this on time on Spotify, on Stitcher, on iTunes, on YouTube, put it on social media, and get the conversation out there. So thank you to our podcast team. Episode 300. Couldn't do it without you. Thank you to our amazing guests. Thank you for being willing to tell your story, and thank you for being vulnerable. I really it's hard to pick favorites, right? So I'm not going to do that. But I am going to just remind you of who we've had on this podcast. Sometimes it's been clients of my green building companies, friends, maybe new friends, maybe someone that's made a career change since I've interviewed them and they're having major impact even somewhere else. I've interviewed prop tech founders, heads of ESG portfolios, really green building professionals all over the world. Everything from how to green up the Super Bowl to living buildings to young up-and-coming architectural students who already have 3 LEED credentials, and that is inspiring as well. So keep up the great work. What we do here on the podcast is we encourage within this green building movement because green buildings matter. Okay, so just in the last 10 episodes, I'm looking at my list here. Alvis, head of ESG, real estate for Bain Capital. Silas was such a great interview. He's a ClimateTech headhunter. Didn't even know that existed. Make sure you listen to episode 298. Silas, it was amazing. Some career tips and some hiring manager tips he gave. We've got innovation and AI discussion with Keith at Slam. We've got everything from talking to those that provide energy, right? Not just to the grid, but maybe a view from the propane standpoint. We want to make sure we're inclusive of all conversations on our path to zero. Check out our interview with Tucker Perkins there and Perk. We've got another amazing guest in Isela, head of ESG at the $50 billion Bridge Investment Group portfolio, and so many more just in the last 10 episodes. I really can't pick favorites, but I'm going to give you a quick playlist, okay? So here's Charlie's playlist. If you have been listening for a long time, or maybe you're new to the Green Building Matters podcast, I'm going to give you about 7 recommendations. I recommend you go to gbes.com/podcast and check out the following. Going all the way back to episode number 48. So you can either type in 48 or Maria Perez, just to check in. And this was a few years ago now. What's going on at Gensler on the sustainability front? Just the amazing story with Maria and her upbringing in Mexico and how she landed at such a great firm like Gensler. She's a lead fellow. We've got Vivian Lofness and the amazing work she's doing at Carnegie Mellon. Check out episode number 37. There are so many others that I've interviewed on the podcast that have called her a mentor. Let's go check out The Wild Conversation, episode number 57 with Jason Twill. Next on the playlist, I would recommend you listen to number 172 with Drew Shula, a fellow social entrepreneur like me. And we actually interview each other and talk entrepreneurship, building up our green building consulting firms in this movement, episode 172. One of my heroes, Emmanuel Powells, who is a living future hero, check out episode 181. Peter Templeton, the current CEO of the U.S. Green Building Council, I was fortunate to do a live podcast interview in Munich, Germany last year. Check out episode 224. We published that after we did the podcast live, recorded it, and then pushed it out for all of you who weren't there in Munich. Episode 224. And finally, you've got to go all the way back to the founding father of LEED, Rob Watson. What an incredible conversation. I've made a career out of LEED and green buildings. It was so fantastic to hear those origin stories and the hard work that those founders put in. So check out Rob Watson, episode 287. So I would call that Charlie's playlist. Whether you've listened for a long time to this podcast or you're new, please go check those out. Give me comments. Speaking of comments, I want to hear from you. I'd really love for you to email me, charlie@gbes.com, or connect on LinkedIn. Send me a message. I'd like to know, what are your favorite episodes? Are there any topics you'd like us to cover? And if you have a guest recommendation, please send that in. All right, so let's talk a little bit about some trends that have popped up and continue, and a glimpse to the future since I've started the Green Building Matters podcast. The shift from operating carbon and efficient buildings, and there's plenty of mandates around that, thankfully, to embodied carbon. It's been trending up for years, but it is upon us. You go to conferences in our space, and we have to get it right with not just operating carbon, but embodied carbon. Net zero energy buildings, right? Is it zero net energy? Is it net zero? Is it net zero by offsets? Is it nets out to zero? Well, how about just net zero energy buildings? But now at scale, there's some large, true net zero buildings that are being constructed or even renovated to get to net zero. With mandates, here in the U.S., thankfully, the Inflation Reduction Act, there's some funding around this. Great organizations like NYSERDA and the state of New York. While there's mandates, say, in New York City, there's also some money available to kind of help accelerate the decarbonization. And these mandates, while they're getting more aggressive from embodied carbon mandates in California, places like New Zealand, one day to go get a building permit, you're going to have your total carbon plan, is a trend we're seeing. There's still the operating carbon. Let's make sure our buildings are energy efficient. Let's make sure we retrofit all of our buildings, but especially those that are 25,000 square feet or larger, coming to a city near you. Resiliency is something that is continuing to be so important. Not just programs like GRESB and how green is your portfolio, what are you doing with resiliency, but there are entire rating systems around resiliency like RELY. We have to make sure, in part because of weather-related events, climate-related events, that we have resilient buildings. Last 2 trends I want you to keep reading up on, we'll keep talking about on the podcast, is to make sure that we keep healthy buildings a thing. right? Programs like Well and Fit Well that were out before the pandemic. Pandemic hits, shines a huge light on how do you make this not just a green building, but a healthy building. Well, we need to get back to the biophilia, the connection to the outdoors, the living walls, bringing nature inside, not just green cleaning, not just better filters. Sure, circadian lighting. Let's get back to just wellness real estate proactively. And we all have to chip in towards that now post-pandemic. And finally, what I'm additionally excited about is bringing back the topic of smart buildings and IoT, but especially now with AI. So those are the trends we've talked about throughout the last 300 episodes. And all of those I am here to validate for you. Keep reading up on and just make sure you know that is a big part of the next 5 years in this green building movement. And lastly, just some projects that inspire me. Amazing projects like the Candida building here at my alma mater, Georgia Tech. I'm based in Atlanta, Georgia. It's a living building. But then if we scale it down and we talk about Emmanuel Powell's home just north of Barcelona by a few hours in the Spanish Pyrenees, it was the only project to actually earn living building status in 2022, and that is Cal Guercho. Just search Sigert.com and Cal Guercho, Guerxo. An amazing example of renovating an existing home, a very old home, and coming out of it with not just LEED Platinum, but living building. Net positive water, net positive energy, net positive waste, and so much more. But then there's famous projects like the Edge in Amsterdam and the Bullitt Center in Seattle. You know, those have inspired so many other buildings to say, you know what, not just what should we do, but what's possible? What can we do? One of our clients, SL Green, largest landlord in New York, fantastic work with One Vanderbilt, one of the latest skyscrapers to do both LEED and WELL certification. Amazing, smart building, green building, and healthy building at scale. A building that's under construction right now that's inspiring is 270 Park Avenue, JP Morgan Chase headquarters. It's actually going to be the 6th tallest building in New York City. It's going to be an all-electric building at that size, that height. And then finally, in that building, they've already packed in sensors and AI, and it's just an amazing project to watch. So those are some projects that have inspired me. Shoot me a message. Let me know some projects that are inspiring you. I've learned a lot over the last 300 episodes. I'm grateful for the team that helps put out this podcast. I'm grateful for all of our podcast guests. You've inspired me. I hope you've enjoyed helping me get your story out to the world. For those listening, if there's someone that you heard me interview and you'd like to be connected to, let me know. That's what this is about. It's about community. So I'm stoked as we hit on episode 300. We will continue this podcast as a weekly Green Building Matters set of encouragement. If you need anything at all, don't be a stranger. Thank you for listening, and congratulations to everyone involved. Episode 300. And don't forget, green buildings really do matter. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Green Building Matters podcast. At gbes.com, our mission is to advance the green building movement through best-in-class education and encouragement. Remember, you can go to gbes.com/podcast for any notes and links that we mentioned in today's episode. And you can actually see the other episodes that have already been recorded with our amazing guests. Please tell your friends about this podcast. Tell your colleagues. And if you really enjoyed it, leave a positive review on iTunes. Thank you so much, and we'll see you on next week's episode.